paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers!
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Bryant, and welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. I spent years investigating both the Franklin Network and the Epstein Network, and they have a number of parallels. So today, I'm going to take a deep dive into the Epstein Network, and then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to show the parallels between the Epstein trafficking network and the Franklin trafficking network. So in 2005, the Palm Beach Police Department had a complaint about Jeffrey Epstein. It was from the parents of a 14-year-old girl, and the Palm Beach police officers talked to the girl, talked to her parents, and the girl described Jeffrey Epstein's home, and she also described his anatomy. So the Palm Beach Police Department decided to investigate at that point, and they found 4 other underage victims of Jeffrey Epstein. And there was a number of corroborating statements from other people regarding those 5 underage girls. So the Palm Beach Police Department was charging Jeffrey Epstein with unlawful sexual activity with 4 minors, 1 count of lewd and lascivious molestation. They felt like they had an airtight case, and they were ready to charge him. And all of a sudden, that investigation was taken away from them. It was assigned to a grand jury. A lot of people are somewhat naive about grand juries. New York judge once quipped that special prosecutors of a grand jury have so much power over grand jurors that they could get them to indict a ham sandwich. In Florida, to have a grand jury for anything other than a capital offense is unheard of. So this grand jury was impaneled, and they came back with, in fact, a ham sandwich. This is from the Palm Beach Post, July 27, 2007. An indictment charging Epstein, 53, was unsealed on Monday, charging him with 1 count of felony adult solicitation of prostitution. So this grand jury did not charge Jeffrey Epstein with a single account of child abuse or having sex with a minor. It indicted him on 1 count of adult solicitation. And the Palm Beach Police Department, they knew that Jeffrey Epstein was guilty, and they became quite vociferous. Michael Ryder, ultimately, the Palm Beach police chief, ultimately went to the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice announced the impaneling of a federal grand jury to investigate Epstein. And then the grand jury was suddenly adjourned, and at this point, the Department of Justice then started clandestine negotiations with Epstein and his dream team of attorneys, which included Alan Dershowitz and Ken Starr. While the Department of Justice was involved in these negotiations, they had a list of 32 victims of Jeffrey Epstein. So these negotiations ultimately resulted in the sweetheart deal that he received in 2008, which was 18 months in county jail. And then he served 13 months, and he just had to go there at night. And here's a clandestine email between the assistant U.S. attorney prosecuting Jeffrey Epstein and the Epstein attorney, Jay Lefkowitz. Now, their negotiations were so sordid and so beyond the pale that they knew that they had to find a special magistrate or judge to sign off on it. And this is Emery Villafana, the assistant U.S. attorney, writing an email. And she says, our most flexible Palm Beach magistrate is on duty on Monday. So assuming we have signed documents by 1:30 or so, we should be able to get Mr. Epstein arraigned on Monday. The Department of Justice and Jeffrey Epstein's attorneys are colluding on this. And the deal that they gave Jeffrey Epstein was so atrocious that they had to find a special magistrate to sign off on it. And then the agreement with Jeffrey Epstein and the Department of Justice was sealed kind of adding insult to injury. And attorneys launching civil suits and the Palm Beach Post appealed the sealing of Epstein's agreement. Ultimately, the government's sealing of the agreement was overturned in the 4th U.S. District Court of Appeals. So what did the agreement say? This is Epstein's non-prosecution agreement, and it exonerates everyone who was part of Jeffrey Epstein's pedophilic network. It's quite a stunning document. In consideration of Epstein's agreement to plead guilty and to provide compensation in the manner described above, if Epstein successfully fulfills all the terms and conditions of this agreement, the United States also agrees that it will not institute any criminal charges against any potential co-conspirators of Epstein, including but not limited to Sarah Kellen, Adriana Ross, Leslie Groff, and Nadia Marcinkova. So basically, that's why they needed that magistrate, is because this is such a horrific deal. And actually, most lawyers that I've talked to have never heard of a deal like this. Epstein was allowed to molest and traffic children for another 10 years. And this is an article from the Daily Beast on July 6, 2019. Epstein is in fact arrested for child trafficking. He was arrested in New Jersey at the Teterboro Airport, and the indictment came from the Department of Justice in Manhattan. And this is from a New York Times article on 8/10/2019. Epstein apparently kills himself. So all those questions that were going to be asked about Jeffrey Epstein and his network seemingly died when he killed himself. But attorney William Barr, he vowed that Epstein's co-conspirators should not rest easy. This is from Reuters on August 12th, 2019. William Barr, our illustrious attorney general, was going to get to the bottom of it, and he was going to make sure that the perpetrators and the procurers not rest easily. And then about 2 weeks later, the New York Times has an article, and they name 6 procurers of Epstein: Ghislaine Maxwell, Sarah Kellen, Leslie Groff, Adriana Ross, Nadia Marcinkova, and Haley Robson. The New York Times basically puts a number of procurers in an article and shows how they broke the law for Jeffrey Epstein. And it's quite remarkable. The Department of Justice did not act after that article came out. Now, here's an article from Reuters in December. The Justice Department mums the word on Maxwell in September, October, and November. Inexplicably, the probe remains at an early stage at the end of December. So Epstein has killed himself, and months later, even after the New York Times has named a bunch of procurers, the probe remains at an early stage. According to the Miami Herald, Virginia Giuffre settled a 2017 defamation lawsuit against Maxwell and received millions of dollars. And in that lawsuit, Virginia actually talked about Maxwell being a procurer, a perp, and also a trafficker. And by the end of January, 3 additional women accused Maxwell of being a perpetrator in lawsuits. So in March, this is from the New York Times, in March, investigators are trying to determine who may have assisted him, Epstein, in recruiting young girls and women to be sexually abused, and who may have moved money to further these efforts. So months down the line, after these civil suits and also an article by the New York Times in naming the procurers, the Department of Justice is still trying to determine who could have been a cohort of Epstein's, even though there's been a tremendous amount of evidence that would tell them who is a cohort of Epstein. So the New York Post reported in July 2nd, 2020, that Ghislaine Maxwell actually had been indicted. She was indicted on 1 count of conspiracy to entice minors to travel to engage in illegal acts, 1 count of enticement of a minor to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, 1 count of conspiracy to transport minors with the intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, 1 count of transportation of a minor with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, and 2 counts of perjury. So Maxwell is looking at a maximum of 35 years. Now, with Maxwell looking at 35 years, that in and of itself is a travesty of justice. A number of Maxwell's victims have come forward and said that she was, in fact, a trafficker of underage girls. And trafficking of minors carries a sentence of between 15 years and life. So Ghislaine Maxwell should have been hammered with multiple indictments of child trafficking, and she should be looking at multiple years in prison. And the other procurers, they should also be hammered with multiple counts of child trafficking, and they should be also looking at many, many years in prison. Just to indict Maxwell and then to not indict her on child trafficking charges is already showing that the Justice Department isn't operating in good faith. Now we're going to change gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about the butler and the Black Book. Former Epstein house manager Alfredo Rodriguez attempted to peddle Epstein's Black Book to an attorney launching civil suits. And the attorney went to the FBI, and Rodriguez was ensnared in an FBI sting. Now, according to the affidavit of an FBI agent, the Black Book contains the names and contact information of material witnesses and additional victims. And Rodriguez circled the names of potential material witnesses and victims. And a material witness is someone whose testimony can be the critical mass of proving someone broke the law. Here are the Florida victims that were circled by Rodriguez. As you can see, there's a lot of victims in Florida. And Jeffrey Epstein went through a lot of underage girls over the years. Here's potential material witnesses circled by Rodriguez and also named by Virginia Giuffre as perpetrators. And Virginia has passed a lie detector test. Rodriguez circled Ghislaine Maxwell as a perpetrator, and Virginia Giuffre named Ghislaine Maxwell as a perpetrator. Rodriguez circled Alan Dershowitz as a perpetrator, and Virginia Giuffre has named Alan Dershowitz as a procurer. Bill Richardson's name was also circled by Rodriguez. Richardson is the former governor of New Mexico, and he was also the energy czar under Clinton. And Virginia Giuffre has said that Bill Richardson had molested her. And Jean-Luc Brunel is also circled, and Virginia Giuffre has said that she was molested by Jean-Luc Brunel. There's some additional potential material witnesses circled by Rodriguez and also named by Virginia Giuffre as perpetrators. The billionaire Lex Wexner, his name was circled by Rodriguez, and Giuffre has named him as a perpetrator. And the former prime minister of Israel was circled by Rodriguez as a perpetrator, and Ehud Barak, and Ehud Barak was also named by Virginia Giuffre as a perpetrator. Now, here's some uncircled names in the Black Book named by Virginia as perpetrators. The Duke of York, Prince Andrew, the scientist Marvin Minsky, the billionaire Glenn Dubin, and former Democratic Senator George Mitchell, who was actually the majority leader of the Senate at one point. And with this slide, Epstein had 21 contact numbers for Bill Clinton in the Black Book, and Donald Trump's name is circled. Now, Giuffre has not named Clinton or Donald Trump as perpetrators, but she did say that she saw two minors accompanying Bill Clinton on Epstein's island. We're going to switch gears again, and we're going to look at the blackmail enterprise of Jeffrey Epstein. So when the Palm Beach Police Department originally executed a search warrant on May 1st, 2006, they came across covert cameras hidden within clocks in Jeffrey Epstein's Palm Beach home. November 18th, 2019, CBS This Morning interviewed Maria Farmer. And this is an excerpt from Maria's interview. The main thing he did when I walked in, and I thought was interesting, he showed me where the cameras, the men monitoring everything were. And I looked on the cameras and I saw toilet, toilet, bed, bed, toilet, bed. So what Maria Farmer is saying here is that multiple rooms in Jeffrey Epstein's New York mansion have been wired for blackmail, and that men, as in plural, are looking at the monitors. So Jeffrey Epstein has men that are plural helping him in his blackmail enterprise. This is a Vanity Fair article from August 12th, 2019. And the Vanity Fair article talked to a former girlfriend of Jeffrey Epstein. And according to her, Epstein said, "I collect people, I own people, I can damage people." And furtherance of showing that Jeffrey Epstein was in fact a blackmail artist. This is a friend of Maxwell's talking about Maxwell. Maxwell also said the island had been completely wired for video. The friend thought that she and Epstein were videotaping everyone on the island as an insurance policy, as blackmail. And this is another quote from Ghislaine Maxwell that has nothing to do with blackmail, but it has everything to do with how these monsters looked upon underage girls. When I asked what she thought of the underage girls, she looked at me and said, "They're nothing, these girls, they are trash. They're nothing, these girls, they are trash." So she looks upon these girls as trash, and she treats them as trash, and she traffics them as trash, but yet she's not indicted on a single count of child trafficking. This is from the New York Times. A journalist had become acquaintances with Jeffrey Epstein, and of course this was off the record. And then once Epstein died, the journalist wrote an article about his interactions with Jeffrey Epstein. And in it, he said, "Mr. Epstein knew an astonishing number of rich, famous, and powerful people, and had photos to prove it. He also claimed to know a great deal about these people, some of it potentially damaging or embarrassing, including details about their supposed sexual proclivities and recreational drug use." So Jeffrey Epstein, his arrogance is coming out at this point, and he's even telling a journalist off the record that he's about blackmail. And this is from another New York Times article. Federal authorities seized hundreds, possibly thousands of sexually suggestive photographs of girls who appear underage, as well as hand-labeled compact discs with titles like "Girls Pics Nude" and with the names redacted, and "Young name redacted plus name redacted." So these DVDs possibly contain blackmail footage of Jeffrey Epstein, given what this article is saying. And they certainly have a lot of images of child pornography, but yet we haven't heard anything about that investigation, and don't know whether any of these girls that were on these pornographic films were approached by law enforcement. This is an article from the Evening Standard. This article was published on January 22nd, 2001. This is way before Jeffrey Epstein became infamous. And this is a quote from the article. "He has a license to carry a concealed weapon, once claimed to have worked for the CIA, although now he denies it." And this is another excerpt from the article. "He has the spook connections and pulls the strings worldwide." This author is definitely thinks that Jeffrey Epstein is working for intelligence. And then another excerpt from the article: "Epstein has joined Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell on 5 of their breaks together in the past 12 months, to Mar-a-Lago, Phuket, Florida, and Windsor, and has also welcomed Prince Andrew to stay at his $30 million New York townhouse at least twice last year." Randy Andy has distanced himself from Jeffrey Epstein, but there's just, they had so much contact. They obviously had a friendship. Prince Andrew can run, but he can't hide. So this is from the Daily Beast on July 7th, 2019. "Alexander Acosta was the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida that ultimately signed off on Jeffrey Epstein's sweetheart deal in 2008, where he spent 13 months in a county jail for molesting a number of, although he wasn't charged, he was charged with 1 count of molestation, but the Department of Justice knew of 32 victims And Alexander Acosta was actually, after he served as U.S. attorney and participated in covering up Jeffrey Epstein's enterprise and gave him, signed off on the non-prosecution agreement. He was bumped up to be Donald Trump's labor secretary, and actually he became Donald Trump's labor secretary after this egregious cover-up. So this is kind of interesting. When Acosta was transitioning to labor secretary, he was asked about the sweetheart deal that he gave Epstein. And he reportedly responded, he had been told to back off, that Epstein was above his pay grade. I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone. So yet we have another example of Jeffrey Epstein belonging possibly to an intelligence organization. So Jeffrey Epstein, protected pedophile and blackmail artist. Jeffrey Epstein purportedly molested Annie Farmer in 1996. The Farmer sisters reported Epstein to the FBI in 1996 and were stonewalled. So Jeffrey Epstein actually came to the federal authorities in 1996, and they just ignored the Farmer sisters. Had they not ignored the Farmer sisters, think of the scores of women now who were victims then, who wouldn't have been molested by Jeffrey Epstein. Over the course of 30 years, Jeffrey Epstein, I believe, trafficked underage girls for about 30 years. He and his cohorts molested scores and scores of underage girls, some reportedly as young as 11 or 12 with impunity. The mainstream media sticks with 14-year-olds, but there's been examples of women or girls that were molested at 13. Actually, one of the lawsuits that's been settled was, and the girl was had been 13 years old when Jeffrey Epstein molested her. And there's a couple of articles that I'm aware of that said that the youngest victim was 11 or 12 years old. The Justice Department had a list of 32 Epstein victims, which could have guaranteed Epstein a life sentence. But according to Alexander Acosta, intelligence intervened, and Epstein was given a sweetheart deal culminating in 13 months in county jail. Alexander Acosta was told to lay off Jeffrey Epstein, that he belonged to intelligence. And what's really interesting here is people that were behind Jeffrey Epstein were able to engineer his sweetheart deal in 2008. That same shadowy network was able to allow Jeffrey Epstein to essentially traffic young women for almost 25 years after the Farmer sisters went to the FBI. So Epstein could not have blackmailed power brokers with impunity because such men typically have access to ruffians, murderers, and even organized crime. The only way Epstein could have blackmailed some of the most powerful men in the world and lived to tell the tale was if those power brokers were aware that Epstein had the backing of a very powerful network or organization that would protect him and seek retribution. And this is an important point. Jeffrey Epstein by himself could not have blackmailed some of the most powerful men in the world. There had to be an organization behind him that said to these people who were blackmailed, these men that were blackmailed, don't even think about trying to hurt Jeffrey Epstein or we'll take you down. And I'll give you an example of someone who was unbelievably generous to Jeffrey Epstein, who also has ties to organized crime. So Les Wexner, a blackmail mark. Les Wexner is the CEO of L Brands, which includes Victoria's Secret, Pink, Bath and Body Works, C.O. Bigelow, Abercrombie and Finch, and he has a net worth of $4.5 billion. Now, this is an article from the New York Times on July 27, 2019. It says that Epstein was introduced to Wexner in the mid to late 1980s. And Mr. Epstein started spending more and more time around Wexner, leaving longtime colleagues puzzled about why he was embracing this newcomer. So the people around Les Wexner were perplexed. Why is Les Wexner embracing Jeffrey Epstein like this? Now, the clearest sign of Mr. Wexner's nearly limitless comfort with Mr. Epstein came in July 1991. Mr. Wexner signed a 3-page legal document known as Power of Attorney that enabled Mr. Epstein to hire people, sign checks, buy and sell properties, and borrow money. So Les Wexner has not known Jeffrey Epstein for that long, and he hands the keys to his empire to Jeffrey Epstein in 1991. Jeffrey Epstein can do whatever he wants with Les Wexner's money. Here are some more, there's two articles about the New York Times that I've taken this information from. On July 6, 2020, Wexner wrote a letter to L. Brand employees vowing that he was never aware of the illegal activity charged in Epstein's latest indictment. After Palm Beach police arrested Epstein for multiple counts of child abuse in 2006, Wexner ostensibly severed his connections 18 months after the fact. But despite their purported rupture in 2007, one of Wexner's charitable foundations received a $56 million infusion from a trust linked to Epstein in 2011. Wexner also claims that he discovered that Epstein had embezzled vast sums of money from him in 2007, but he never notified authorities. So Wexner is saying that basically Jeffrey Epstein trampled all over him, and their financial relationship went along, was definitely active after Jeffrey Epstein had his sweetheart deal in 2008. And Les Wexner is also saying that Jeffrey Epstein ripped him off. So we're going to look at Les Wexner's ties to organized crime. Arthur Shapiro was the partner of an esteemed law firm, Schwartz, Shapiro, Kelman, Warren, which represented the retail empire of business potentate Les Wexner. And this is an excerpt from the article. Someone wanted to silence Columbus lawyer Arthur L. Shapiro. 2 bullets were fired point blank into his head as he pounded on the door of a Northwest Side condo on the morning of March 6, 1985. 25 years later, the slaying remains unsolved. So this is a high-flying attorney, and he's a partner in a law firm that works for, that does a lot of business with Les Wexner. Shapiro was the law firm's point man for dealing with Lex Wexner and L. Brands. Now, here's a 1990 report on the Shapiro homicide. It's from the Columbus Police Department, and it's very, very telling. This report was so explosive on the death of Columbus attorney Arthur L. Shapiro that the police chief ordered it to be destroyed. And obviously it wasn't destroyed because I have a copy of it. But here's this explosive homicide report from 1991, 6 years after Shapiro's death, that the police chief orders to be destroyed. So what is so explosive in this? There's some excerpts from it. From the predicate facts presented, it appears that Lex Wexner had established contact with associates reputed to be organized crime figures, one of whom was a major investment partner, and another was using the limited headquarters as a mailing address. Francis J. Walsh, or Frank, is the owner and chief executive officer of Walsh Trucking Company out of New Jersey. Walsh Trucking has been a primary transporter for the Limited in Columbus. In July 1984, Walsh was being investigated by the New York Organized Crime Task Force. Notices to this effect were addressed to Walsh at 1 Limited Parkway, Wexner's headquarters. Thus, the concluding hypothesis is that Arthur Shapiro could have answered too many of these sorts of questions and might have been forced to answer them in his impending grand jury hearing. So this report goes on to implicate Les Wexner in Shapiro's homicide. In the last slide, I talked about the police report demonstrating that Les Wexner had ties with organized crime or the mafia. Now, here's a Women's Wear Daily from June 25th, 1987. These are a couple of excerpts. Walsh had done in excess of 90% of the Limited's business. Court papers show that Walsh's revenues from the Limited totaled $73,600,000 in 1985. So Francis J. Walsh and Les Wexner were obviously very well acquainted with each other, because in 1 year, Les Wexner gave Walsh over $73 million. Now here's an article from the Bergen Record. talking about Walsh's connections to the organized crime. It's from June 9th, 1996. Walsh, described as an associate of the Genovese crime family by federal investigators, also pleaded guilty to 2 counts of mail fraud for falsifying loan applications that netted him $3 million in bank loans. With the last 2 slides, I've shown that the Limited used Walsh's services very prolifically, and that Walsh was in fact an organized crime figure. So Jeffrey Epstein, the cover-up continues. The federal government covered up Epstein's child trafficking for years, and he was also protected as a blackmailer. The American people must unequivocally demand that the Justice Department exact justice on Jeffrey Epstein's matrix of procurers and perpetrators, and also on the intelligence network or organization that protected him legally and also physically. If the Department of Justice is indifferent to victims in a proven trafficking case, then there is little hope for the vast majority of victims. If the perpetrators in the Epstein case are allowed to go scot-free, then all perpetrators are empowered. The parallels between the Epstein and Franklin networks. The Franklin network was larger than the Epstein network, but the Franklin network was operational for approximately 12 years, whereas the Epstein network was operational for at least 25 years. Both networks flew children around the country and pandered them to sundry power brokers. And in both networks, the power brokers could be extremely sadistic to the children. That came up quite a bit when I was investigating the Franklin network, but as I got to know some of the Epstein victims, they told me tales of horrific sadism. And I initially thought that only the Franklin network produced child pornography, but the Epstein network also produced child pornography. And both networks had high-level connections to 2 presidential administrations. The Franklin network had connections to both the Reagan and Bush 1 administrations, and the Epstein network had connections to the Clinton and also the Donald Trump administrations. Both networks were reported to law enforcement, but those reports were just simply ignored. The first time the Franklin network got reported was in 1986, when Ulysses Washington came forward and told Julie Walters and her foster mother. Julie Walters was a youth worker at Boys Town, that she'd been trafficked by Lawrence E. King and flown around the country. And law enforcement just sat on Ulysses' allegations for 3 or 4 years until they were forced to act. Maria Farmer went to the FBI in 1996 and told the FBI that Jeffrey Epstein was running a pedophile network, and she was just ignored by the FBI. And both networks required the subversion of grand juries. The Franklin network required the subversion of 3 grand juries. As I said, it was bigger than the Epstein network. There were 2 grand juries in Nebraska, 1 state and 1 federal, that declared that the child abuse allegations had no substance. And actually, the state grand jury said that the child abuse was part of a carefully crafted hoax, but the grand jury never named the hoaxers, which is kind of interesting. And with the Epstein grand jury in Florida, it was definitely corrupt. The Palm Beach Police Department had the names of, well, 5 victims had gone on record with the Palm Beach Police Department. That special prosecutor and his assistant had the names of 23 victims. And ultimately, they only called 1 victim to the stand and basically skewered her. So that grand jury found that Jeffrey Epstein entailed absolutely no child abuse, like the Franklin case. The networks would have remained covered up if it hadn't been for the tenacity of the Nebraska Senate's Franklin Committee and Gary Caradori in the case of the Franklin network. When Lawrence E. King busted out the credit union for $40 million, senators formed the Franklin Committee. They were just looking at his financial crimes because King hadn't been audited in 4 years, and federally insured credit unions have to be audited every year. So they formed this committee just to look at King's financial crimes. But after the committee was formed, social service personnel came to them and said, Lawrence E. King is running a nationwide pedophile network. And those social services personnel had given their accounts of 2 victims who shared very similar stories to both federal and state investigators, and they were just simply ignored. The Franklin Committee was under a tremendous amount of pressure to disband. There were threats, and they hired Gary Caradori, who was one of the finest private investigators in the country at that time. He had been with the Nebraska State Patrol as an investigator, and then he formed his own investigation business, which was called CaraCorp. He had about 120 employees. So Gary Caradori was uncovering victims. He was videotaping them. He was uncovering all kinds of documentation. I managed to acquire a lot of his documentation. He acquired over 200 flight logs of Lawrence E. King's, and most of those flight logs went to Washington, D.C. So you had some very brave people on the Franklin Committee, and you had Gary Caradori, who were harassed quite heavily, but they refused to back down. They had some moral barometer in them that just refused to let children be abused with impunity. And the Palm Beach Police Department, there were some really stand-up guys, but the Palm Beach Police Department Chief, Michael Ryder, was really, really a stand-up guy. Without him, the Epstein allegations never would have come out. He refused to back down, and he was heavily harassed, like Gary Caradori, but he would not back down. And when that state grand jury came back with a conclusion that no children had been molested, he hit the roof, and he became so vociferous that he got the feds to get involved, the Department of Justice to get involved in the Epstein case. Of course, the Department of Justice covered it up, but he would not take a step back. And he had some stalwart investigators that would not take a step back. They were really concerned about these children. And the final parallel that I'll mention between the Epstein and the Franklin networks is William Barr, Donald Trump's Attorney General. He was also George Bush Sr.'s Attorney General. If you're just listening to this on audio, I've got a nice picture of Mr. Barr smiling in front of an American flag. But William Barr was really instrumental in covering up the Epstein network. He made sure that after Epstein had died, that Ghislaine Maxwell was the only one that was indicted. There should have been multiple indictments. There should have been multiple indictments for procurers, and there should have been multiple indictments for perpetrators. But William Barr made sure that the Department of Justice indicted no one else. And with the Franklin network, Richard Thornburg was the Attorney General initially who started to cover it up. And then he went to run for Senate in Pennsylvania. He'd been the former governor of Pennsylvania. And he went to run for Senate. And then when he vacated the Attorney Generalship, it was William Barr who became our Attorney General. And William Barr is a very unctuous character. If you do some Googling on William Barr, you'll find all kinds of sordid facts. So that is the Nick Bryant podcast for today. And thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for watching.